So we're going to talk about the topic being, I don't know if a slide will come up, but keep talking and no one explodes, which is a bit of a crazy idea of mine, but there's a kind of point to it. Not sure if we have a slide or not. Just coming up, I think. So the whole point of this really is that communication is key, and in IndieTrack, we talk a lot about culture, we talk a lot about making content, design, and practicalities of being a business, but we don't often talk about what it's practically like being in a team. So I thought I'd get some three amazing guys to talk to me about their experiences, and let's start by could you introduce yourself and tell people what you do?
Yeah. Hey everyone, my name's Akash Thakkar. I'm a composer and sound designer based here in Seattle, and I've worked on games like Destiny, Hyper Light Drifter, did all the audio on that, and a whole bunch of other stuff that I can't talk about right now. Hooray!
Jason.
Hi, Jason Robar. I've run 3 different indie studios here in the Seattle area, and also in China and in Germany, and so had a lot of different teams in a lot of different time zones and dealt with communication issues and culture issues all over the place.
And Seth.
I'm Seth Crofton. I work with large companies like Wargaming all the way down to small indie studios over in India and Romania, along with manufacturing companies in all different time zones.
So obviously nothing's ever gone wrong when people stop talking to each other. But I mean, do you have any actual examples that you are allowed, or at least can change the names to protect the innocent, that illustrate why communication is important? Akash, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so for me, because I'm freelance and do all my work remotely, most of that falls on me to actually reach out to people and actually start communicating with them. And when I first started, I was just like, oh, if I do the work and never say a word, everything will turn out fine, right? So when I first begun, I just kind of went off in my hole and did my work and then kind of delivered assets and thought, they'll notice, right? They don't notice, and they got real mad. So what I had to learn was slowly but surely that I need to constantly, and to a degree if I'm remote, overly communicate and make sure that they know everything's being delivered. I'm working on X, I'm doing Y, making sure that that's all super clear.
Because they've got all their own issues to worry about, and as being an evangelist, I've been a lone wolf for such a long time. I was in the office like twice a year, so unless you talk to people regularly, you just kind of. Jason, do you have any particular examples?
Yeah, we actually, my co-founder and I actually created a culture around communication. When I do my interviews, I let the other guys talk about all the technical issues, are you a good artist, whatever, but I actually drill in for communication style. It is the most important thing for bringing somebody on the team, bar none. How many languages do you speak? What other cultures do you understand? And what is your communication style? So we actually do a thing we call Fight Club, which is at any moment, at any time, any 2 people can call Fight Club. And it means I need to take you aside, and you and I, or that person can call it to me, no matter who you are in the company, whether you're the CEO or whether you're the intern who just came in the door, and you can step aside and try to resolve a communication issue. And when somebody tells you that code word, come up with a code word that makes sense for you guys. That's a code word to say, I've got to get something off my chest. There's something going wrong in the communication. And you can kind of call a Fight Club and say, hey, I think the 2 of you need to take this out. It's an example that I call the red table, blue chair problem, which is I have seen so many meetings go haywire because 2 people are arguing over the color red versus the color blue. And one of them is screaming for 5 minutes that the tables need to be red. And the other is saying, no, damn it, the chairs need to be blue. And if you're the third party, you can kind of hear, wait a minute, they're arguing about something completely different. They're focused on the red or the blue, and they're not really focused on the fact that they're talking about chairs and tables. And so if you're that third-party person, you have the chance in any meeting to kind of solve that communication problem when you're listening to both sides and you see that they're not really listening to each other. And they actually could be in complete agreement and arguing for 5 and 10 minutes and completely derail a meeting that way.
Well, and in other industries, it's the same way. When I worked for Ford Motor Credit Company, and when I did, loans for people for their businesses and that type of thing, you have to deal with underwriters, and they're looking at things completely different than you. And if you're assuming that they read the paperwork correctly, I had an underwriter who didn't even know what a profit and loss statement was. I had to explain what deposits meant to an underwriter, assuming that she knew her job at that point in time, right? So assumption is never good. And so we always have a thing that there's no such thing as a stupid question, except for the one that's never asked.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. I have a slightly kind of different take on it from my time at PlayStation. I worked on PlayStation Home, and myself and the head of the development, production side, we would regularly go to it in meetings, and everybody was shocked because we also always went to lunch together. And it's like we're having this talk about his kids and my kid at the time, But the ability to fall out professionally but not personally was absolutely critical. And I kind of almost don't trust people until I can have an argument with them, which is, I'm not sure if that's a kind of good thing or not, but...
No, it's good because it shows trust in that aspect. And that's one of the things for teams communication is trust. You have to understand what the other person is telling you is true to them, just as they understand it's true to you as well, too.
So I want to kind of go a little bit more into something that you were saying, Jason, about the culture side of things. We talk a lot about company culture. We talk about how communication is key to that. But what does that actually mean? I mean, I've sat in these... I had a lot of time in telcos. Anyone who's worked in a telecommunications company will probably know exactly the white knuckle fear of the away day, where you're going to be told about how you're going to follow some sort of method, and it's always like the blue chip or the white chip type of. It's horrible, enforced culture. Mm-hmm. But what does culture actually mean in this context? I mean, what's the right way to do that?
Well, I think the culture comes from a couple of different aspects. I mean, it can be as simple as common assumptions about what the holidays are. I mean, it can be just so simple that just last week we were working with a developer down in Mexico. They assumed we knew they were going to be gone on Wednesday the 1st of May, because everybody's gone on May 1st, right? We think Mexico and we think, oh, May 5th, right? Cinco de Mayo. But it just turns out that they're just gone on Wednesday and they didn't bother to remind us because they assumed we knew. So it can be as simple as that, right? Just common assumptions. In Germany, holidays change every state, not just the whole national holidays, but every state within Germany changes their holidays, because you could travel 2 miles from one city to another and the holiday patterns are completely different. So it can be those kind of simple things, all the way to more deeply important cultural issues about just understanding common things. When we first started working with outsourcing with a Russian team, we asked for a Batman model. Guess what we got?
A man bat.
A man bat. Had nothing to do with Batman. It was a Batman. It was a sort of hybrid thing of, wings with his bat guy, and has nothing to do with the DC comic character, right? You would assume everybody knows who Batman is, but it turns out not everybody does.
Well, and we have the same problem with that as well, too, in regards to music as well. Like with our Indian studio, there's so many different states, there's so many different types of music, and we think Bollywood. And
India's just one culture, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there's
exactly.
just one culture in all of
culture.
India.
It's not 85 languages or whatever it is.
Oh, absolutely. But when we start off our talks, our video communications and that type of thing, we're going to chit-chat for a few 5 or 10 minutes beforehand, because that establishes culture. And I asked a couple questions. What did you guys do this weekend? What music did you listen to? And that helps establish part of that cultural knowledge for me as well, too. And they're able to communicate that as well.
We sound like you're almost saying you should treat someone like a human being.
Not an email address.
I believe in a benevolent dictatorship as a father, so we try to petition that power.
I get it. But musically, is this the same thing? I mean, obviously, it's not just music you're involved with, but it seems to me like there are aspects of this cultural question which is not just about the way that we interact with people, but also the way we kind of realize projects.
Right. Yeah. So I've found that from like a remote point of view and working mostly out of studios or not in studios, I find that the culture tends to be the rules, the kind of these invisible rules that dictate what behaviors are seen as safe. So if we are in a toxic culture, we believe that being toxic is the safe thing to do. Our lizard brain right here is okay with that. Whereas if we're in a positive culture, then we know that being positive is safe and being toxic is not. So I've found that through the interaction of people, even just on something like Slack, you pick up on those rules kind of subconsciously, and that helps dictate a project quite a bit and where it's going to go.
Although there's a challenge with that, isn't there? Because any text-based communication is fraught with the lack of the emotional and also the anonymity. And there's some great psychology that shows that any social network experience, particularly virtual, people basically avoid those social norms because they consider themselves anonymous, even if they know they're not. So how does that impact that process? Yeah,
so that you need to have kind of a rule, like one rule that I state is if something's important, always get on the phone or Skype or something like that. If it's not just, hey, these assets are here, or something kind of banal or boring, I have a rule of never having Fight Club or something like that just over Slack or just over text. And if something is going on, I will also kind of chime in and suggest, hey, don't do this over text because no one understands what's going on from an emotional context. This thing was sarcastic. This person was joking. Whatever it may be, that never comes across.
I mean, I do wonder whether there's a certain amount of experience that comes with it. So people who've had the experience of working remotely, people who've had experience of working internationally, are often less prone, in my experience. Is that true, or is that just an assumption?
No, that's very true. And the other rule that kind of goes as a corollary to that is don't assume that the heads of state are the movers and shakers, as I say it. So you can get an org chart from another team that you're working with. You can say, this person's got this job title. Don't assume that means anything. When you start working with another team, or you've got another team that comes on board, it's a rule of thumb that I call heads of state and movers and shakers. You can go into a meeting and say, well, this is the head of marketing, or this is the director of engineering, or what have you. But look around for who people are turning to for kind of nodding their head and then going on. You'll find out that it's really important to understand that person is the mover and shaker, and the guy who says yes, or the gal who really approves things, or the person whose opinion matters more than the particular title that you might assume has the decision-making authority. Turns out, the head of marketing always turns to this senior engineer for opinions on whether or not they can do that, or whether it's feasible, or whatever. And the director of engineering is kind of a figurehead that nobody listens to. That's one of the first things I learned when I was at Microsoft, and I went to an Electronic Arts meeting, and all these people were turning to this one person whose title had no authority, but you could tell in the room right away, if that person was on board, the whole team would be on board. So don't assume that heads of state are the actual decision makers. Look for the movers and shakers.
Right, and culturally as well too, because overseas, different titles mean different things. But as some friends of Microsoft, when they were over in the Middle East, one person didn't come up to a meeting, the people below him did, because that person was from the wrong tribe, wrong family in that aspect. And so the other people would not listen to him, but he knew that the people underneath him would be listened to. So you never assume anything on that part, especially since you're used to working, shall we say, in a free area like North America. Other countries are not that way.
No, I know there's often referred to as the hippo problem, so the highest paid person's opinion. That's often kind of a barrier to communicate. One of the things that I think helps deal with this is by establishing a common set of, common vision by which you measure success. And for me, vision is about direction, not a destination. It's a bit like Neverland, second star to the left and straight home till morning. I mean, do you see any sort of tricks like that you guys have seen that can help a new team, establish those kind of rules?
Yeah, so I found vision, just like you said, and one thing that I do on any new team that I jump onto is, how are we going to course correct if and when something goes wrong? Because it's almost certain that something is going to go wrong, though most of us here have probably made games and they started perfect and ended perfect, right?
Yes.
Every single one. So we need to know how we need to know how we're going to course correct. And I even have, because audio is so ephemeral, I even set up vocabulary that we can use to know what we're going to say when it's time to course correct, because it's such an ephemeral art form that's hard to describe. I set that out at the early beginning stages, so everyone's on the same page when it's time to say, this needs fixing. So that helps a lot.
And part of that Fight Club culture that I talked about as part of our culture was making sure that people understand we're not establishing processes to prevent problems. We're establishing processes to identify problems. Yeah. If you think that you're putting these rules in place so that that will prevent the problem, then people will start to hide the fact that a problem happened, because they think the rules of the game are to never have a problem happen. And in fact, if you turn it around and say your KPIs are the things that we value, are you finding a problem and bringing it up? That's what's rewarded. Make sure people feel rewarded in the culture, in that other culture, because there's many cultures where doing that is verboten, where it is not allowed. You don't want to discuss problems, you want to hide them. And for us in game development, we have to find problems, discuss solutions, come to common ground and solve them rather than prevent problems. So that's probably the first thing about cultural process that you want to establish across everybody, is that that's the goal. Finding problems, not hiding them.
So in some cases where you're trying to change culture as well too. So our studio in India on that part, we're trying to create. And here they have a huge culture of not creating, but bringing to the client what the client wants. But when you're the client, how do you create? Yeah. So getting that mindset across to them on that part, even for training right now, is rather interesting. And that allows for a little more creative process in communicating that than normally they're used to, what they would see.
Yeah, our team in China was the same way. They were very much not wanting to bring forward any ideas that would seem to challenge the ideas of authority. where we wanted them to bring those creative factors to the forefront. They thought, and they assumed we would be mad if they challenged our creative decisions, where in fact, as Americans, we generally kind of want a discussion, we want a synthesis of ideas. Other cultures are like, no, you tell me what to do, and even if I think that's wrong or I know it's wrong, I won't bring it up. And we want to challenge that, so you've got to make sure that's rewarded as part of your culture.
Yeah, I mean, how do you look at that? Because that loss of face, I remember working in, in Sony, there were basically the mindset of a meeting was you had to turn up, but you didn't have to be awake. Literally, I mean, people went to sleep in meetings. And it was like, but what? And it was this understanding that actually it was the being there that was the socially important thing. The decisions had already been made, which is, as somebody like me who goes in fighting all the time, basically was crazy. But dealing with that meant that we had to step up our game and change our mindset. We're the ones who had to change. We couldn't change the way they operated. Is that your kind of experience too? I mean, do you have that kind of, when you're dealing with different cultural kind of norms, how have you dealt with it?
Yeah, so from my point of view, when things are kind of frictional in that way, it is, for me, I start from like my point of view, my individual point of view, and start changing it there. And that makes it easier for me to communicate and at least be an example to other people when things need to be changed. But for larger studios, I'm actually not sure how that would work.
No, I'll let you go on that part because I'm still thinking how that...
Well, I mean, let's expand on that. I mean, let's ask that bigger question. It's like, is this just basically easier with smaller numbers of people?
Well, no, because that comes down to the type of people who are involved, right? Because I've got a project, there's a couple of New Yorkers, and they're not as easy to deal with as, I mean, they are stereotypical to a certain thing. They're New Yorkers, right?
Yeah.
So, we're a little bit easy going out here, but occasionally you have to step up and go, no, it needs to be done this way, and here's why. If you can explain why to somebody, that usually works out well, because they've understood the problem, they've understood that you've understood the problem, and you give them an answer back, not just because I said so. That never works.
Well, and I think we started with a lot of examples about international, but I think there's also some really good examples about, culturally speaking, between job fields.
Yeah.
I have learned over the years that every single person in the entire company wants to be creative. It is part of the human nature to create. That's why if you get a good CFO, he creates an entirely new Excel worksheet that nobody's ever seen, right? It's a work of art. If you dive into that spreadsheet, you're like, oh, that's amazing. How did you do that? And that's his inborn nature as a human being to want to create. The marketing person that we struggle with sometimes in how we work with development and marketing teams. That's a cultural divide, just as much as it is between India and the US. And that marketing person, they want to be a part of the creative process, and sometimes we as a team lock them out. So they go off and create a trailer, spend $500,000 creating a trailer that has nothing to do with your assets. I've had that happen multiple times, right? Why? Because they want to be a creative person. And so if you can find ways to make sure that the human spirit of the other people on your team that are necessary for your success, whether that's your publisher, whether that's your audio team that's an outsourcing company, or whoever it is, if you can find ways to make sure that their creativity and their natural inclinations of what they want to accomplish, listening to their individual goals and to their organizational goals, are included in your process.
Absolutely.
That's another part of conquering that
problem.
problem.
By doing that, because as somebody who sometimes wears that marketing hat, my issue is that you guys, the developer side, hasn't always understood the player and hasn't understood the market.
Right.
And I want you to build a game that matches the needs of a market so we could be all successful. And so unless we're having a dialogue and you're taking into those different perspectives, how can you perform to your best?
Well, so what we do, especially with our weekly communications, is that there will be a couple of days where we will be able to, literally chit-chat away above and beyond what we're normally supposed to be talking about in regards to the project in that case. And then there are a couple of days where it's not chit, it's just tat. You're going right to the problem, and that's it. That's what we're going to talk about, because otherwise you are wasting a lot of the time away. Potentially, you're going over into rabbit trails you don't need to. But if you do know that you're consistent with your communication, that you allow them the time to express themselves in that part. Yeah, it's amazing what people will do above and beyond what you ask them to.
Because a lot of people hate meetings, don't they? I mean, let's face it, how many meetings are you in that you hate? Anyone love meetings? Actually, I do. I actually do love meetings. I actually get more work done face to face because I can get to the point and look at you as a human being and say, look at me, we need this because of X, Y, Z. Whereas if you don't structure that meeting, if you don't have an idea of what the goal of that meeting is, you end up churning.
Boom. That's the most important part of our cultural establishment is we make sure that every meeting we start with, we know what are the win conditions. Treat it like a game. Design your meetings as if they are a game system. What is the win condition for this meeting? And part of that win condition is getting it done sooner than the scheduled time on the meeting, right? If you can get it done in 50 minutes instead of 60, hey, we all win, and now let's go out to lunch sooner than later, and make that a part of the reward. How many meetings did you finish sooner than they were scheduled this week? Also, we have a no meeting Wednesdays. So making sure that there is never a meeting scheduled on a particular day, that means everybody on the team can know I can schedule my dentist appointment or whatever else I need to get done. That extra bit of level design or that extra refinement. No meeting Wednesdays is a great part of a cultural communication that helps establish those kinds of wins.
Well, I'm going to ask one more too, because we're doing it with different time zones as well too, right? So I'm usually the one that's flexible, so I'm up all different hours on that part. But usually when you're doing with a larger team, we have rotated those hours so not everybody's always screwed with I've got to be up late no matter what type of thing. So you want to actually add that flexibility as well too.
Yeah, I was in the UK doing the communication between the Japanese team in Sony and the American team and the European team. So I was doing my calls at 8 a.m. for the Japanese team and 8 p.m. with the US team. Fridays are very long days. So we've had some really good examples of kind of some cool techniques, like the safe word and the no meeting Wednesdays. Do you guys have any kind of other techniques or tools that you want to suggest these guys should think about?
Yeah, so for me, one thing I like to do, and this is more of a soft thing, but when you're communicating with all sorts of different types of people, just realize, and I learned this from Simon Sinek, who wrote the great book Start With Why and Leaders Eat Last, that this emotional part of our brain and this logical word part of our brain aren't connected in any way, shape, or form, which is why it's so hard to actually communicate our emotions. So what I like to do is when I am communicating, when I need a change, or I'm just saying something, even if it's banal, I try to appeal to both sides. I don't just say, oh, here are the assets, and I'm done, because that's kind of banal and boring. I might add a little bit of emotional flair into it, just so that on that Slack group where it's all text and all gray and all boring, it'll actually seem like, oh, cool, we're getting progress, hooray, they get a little dopamine hit, that sort of thing. I want it to actually be, when work is done, I want people to feel good about it, whether or not I did it or someone else did it.
I think one of the other things is reassessing people's goals as individuals and as teams on a frequent basis. So whether that's every 6 months or every 12 months, some sort of basis that everybody knows, we're going to check in and say, are we still on the same page? Are we meeting your goals individually? Because I look at myself as not as a manager, but as the leader-servant part. So if everybody on my team, they can fire me at any time by going and getting a job somewhere else. So my job is constantly about retention of my partners, retention of my publishers, and going through this kind of a little bit of a checklist with one-on-one with someone and understanding, have your goals changed? Did you get married? Did you have a kid? Did you have a car accident and now money is way more important to you than this other factor that came in before? People change, their goals change, and they may not even be aware of it consciously. So if you have a regular moment where you can sit down, and even with your partner, your co-founder, your leads, your person that you work for, if you can help establish that culture where you're reassessing each other's goals, you can make sure that doesn't diverge too quickly or unknowingly. So I think that's another big thing. Have a checklist where you can openly discuss and write down your goals, and then everybody can kind of look at that. So we have that as part of our internal evaluation sheet that we do.
And use the right tools for the right job. We use Jira for problems with the game code, and we know that information is not going into Slack, right? It's not going into Google Drive, it's not going to Dropbox. Use the right tools correctly and consistently on that part, because that causes so many different problems, and which causes future headaches as well too, which can lead to a fight club in a different way, without a doubt. So, yeah.
I mean, for me, it comes down to understanding what is the best outcome, not just for you, but for the other person involved. And hopefully, if we keep talking, no one explodes.
That's right.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.